Monopoly. Monopoly is on the far side of the spectrum from competition. So we had perfect competition, and there's the spectrum and monopoly is as unlike perfect competition, as hot as from cold. Actually, I would say hot is from cold this way, and as negative infinity is from infinity. They are totally different. So the things we learned about, like in perfect competition, things like, oh, you can't make economic profits in the long run. Well, guess what? You can in the long run with monopoly. Okay? So, let's list a few characteristics of monopoly. Now, I'm talking about perfect monopoly. That's a P. And by that I mean a monopoly that will never, ever, ever go away. In other words, you're the only seller, and no one can ever get in and compete with you ever until the end of time. Of course, that doesn't exist, just like perfect competition doesn't exist. But as an industry moves one direction or the other, they become ever so much more so. They become more like monopoly or more like competition if they're moving that way. So understanding the extremes means that we can realize what will happen if we say increase competition or increase regulation in an industry. We'll move closer to those conditions, but you can't ever, not with perfect monopoly, which doesn't exist. But let's talk about those conditions. Absolute barriers to entry. I'm not going to write out because it's a really small board, okay? Absolute barriers to entry. Leave some room because I want to talk about those kind of things. So go to 2, 1 seller. Number 3, you're selling a product that can't be replaced. So it's valuable, it's something people need. And 4, make sure I don't forget them all, price searcher. Some textbooks say price setter because remember in competition you were a price taker. But in this situation, the monopolist is a price searcher. They search for the best price. They can't just set any price they want. I mean, just because you have a monopoly, let's say I have a monopoly in Marge Simpson blue beehive wigs. I've got a monopoly. I'll sell them for $1 million each. Yeah, I'm going to be rich. Okay, yeah. There's no class reaction to my silly talk, but hopefully you grinned. No, of course not. Of course not, right? I'm not going to be rich because there's no market. There's no demand for those wigs. So just because I go to the effort of obtaining a monopoly doesn't mean I'm going to automatically get rich. So I can't set a price of $1 million per wig if no one will buy it. But I can search for how high demand will let me set that price. And I'll set the highest price demand will allow. Okay? So they're a price searcher, not necessarily a price setter. Although some textbooks do call them price setters. I don't. Okay, so let's talk about these types of barriers. 4 of them. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4. When government, that's an O, when government controls competition, if the government's on your side, it doesn't happen very much in this country, but for example in Mexico, they have a lot of situations where the government licenses you and says you get to own the cell phone company, or you get to be a part of the bank, and it goes to people who already have connections. So you have an aristocracy that always ends up sharing the ability to stay in the aristocracy with others of their kind, their group. So in that case, the government is basically saying, no, Mr. or Mrs. Average Citizen, you can't open a bank, because the licenses are only going to be given out to people we consider to be safe. In other words, they're controlling competition, and that sets up a barrier. Now this list is of barriers, not absolute barriers. And before I go any further, I do need to talk about that. Because in the 1800s, if you were a wheat farmer in Nebraska, the only way to get your wheat to the markets in the cities was that railroad that ran through your county. And it seemed to those farmers that railroad had an absolute barrier to entry, and that forever they would have a monopoly if something wasn't done. But that was the 1800s. And by the way, that monopoly was given to them by the government. It said, I want you to build a railroad, and I'm going to give you the right to have that railroad and nobody else. But they gave them the right to put the railroad through property, public takings of land. Okay, so it seemed that they had the ultimate monopoly, and there was violence. There were a lot of examples of the monopoly taking advantage of the farmers and charging outrageous amounts, but the farmers, the only other choice was horse and buggy, wagons and oxen, taking wheat slowly to market and coming back. But do they have an absolute barrier to entry now, 21st century? Well, we don't have to. If we're a farmer in Nebraska, we don't have to use the railroads now. There are semi-trucks. There's interstate highways. So, to be a perfect monopoly, these barriers have to withstand technological change, withstand the changes over time, and that doesn't exist. Although you can come really close for quite a few decades. You see what I'm saying? Okay, let's talk about these other situations. Ownership of a resource. If it's a key resource, I can put that little word key up here. China has been buying up rare earths from all over the world because rare earths are something that formerly wasn't, I mean, we just didn't use them, but now with electronics, there's all these rare earth metals that are used in electronics. And China started buying them up. And suddenly, they had ownership of a large percentage of the rare earths in the world. And I don't have an exact amount of percentage for you because it kept changing. So, but it was a lot. And everybody's really worried. Now China can charge anything they want to anybody that wants to build electronics. They've got themselves a barrier to entry. But people started realizing that rare earths are found where gold is found. And in the United States, we've had gold mining like the 1849ers. I mean, if you're into the NFL, there's the San Francisco 49ers, right? Why did they call them that? After the 1849 gold rush. And all of those people rushed out there to find gold on public land, and they threw away the tailings in big piles. Guess what? Those tailings are full of rare earths. In 1849, nobody knew they had value. So once people realized that, now there's companies out there trying to get permission to take the tailings away, and we've discovered that America has lots of rare earth. It had been thrown away. So they had just these stacks of gravel and dirt and rare earth. But it wasn't gold, so it got thrown away. But anyway, for a while we were worried about China having a barrier to entry to keep other companies and countries out of the electronics business. Let's see, what about network externalities? Sometimes people won't buy a new technology because the networking isn't there. Like gas stations are all over the place for gas-powered cars. And when the new technology came out, there weren't electricity stations all over the country. And so you could get an electric car, but you were pretty much stuck close to home because the network didn't exist for you to just, stop for some electricity and then move along because of the lack of network. So that can be a barrier to entry for a new technology if the network isn't there. I think there's a fifth one that I don't have in my notes, but I do remember, so I'm going to talk about that one. How about licensing and trademarks? Patents, etc. Actually, that could be 5 and 6, couldn't it? Licensing. Let's do that. Let's say that there's 6 of them. Licensing, trademarks, patents, copyrights. Okay. Have you ever wondered why you have to study so hard to get licensing to cut hair? There was this lady who worked her way out of the public housing off of welfare in the Chicago area by setting up places to get your hair braided. I don't know, cornrows, or I don't know what they call it, but where you get all kinds of little tiny braids all over your head. And she set it up on an assembly line system. Literally, you could come in and they would pass you, they would, 3 or 4 ladies would come up and do the first part of your hair, and then they would pass you to someone else and then get another customer, and they'd start on the So everybody was an expert in one little bit. And it was assembly line, and she was able to do the I don't know what you call them, but micro braiding very fast and cheaply. And there was an outcry from who? She worked her way out of the I think they called it the projects. So she worked her way into a nice apartment in Chicago, and who shut her down? There was an outcry from hairdressers because she didn't have a hairdressing license. And the reasoning for having the hairdressing license is not what you think. The excuse is, well, you might use chemicals that burn someone's hair. And so it's like, we're concerned about customers. But are they? What industry, without regulation, what industry would hairdressers be in? Right? I mean, think about it. What does it cost you to get started? Scissors and a comb? Right? There's not a lot of barriers to entry, and anybody could do it. And I just am worried about this battery. Let me see. We are still recording. Good. So anybody can do hairdressing. So there will be lots of people coming in and taking your market away, unless we make it hard to get into the market. Oh, we're moving this direction. You see that? Regulation keeps people from competing because you're like, hey, you need to go to school for 10 months. And there was a hairdressing school in Arkansas where I used to teach. And